Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Again, as always, I appreciate y'all's faithfulness. Thank you so much for being here and taking advantage of the opportunity that we have to engage in Bible study and look at these verses and what God wants us to know. And we've got to try our best to convince other people how important this is to take that time to look at a kind of a detailed examination of God's Word. There's no way that's bad for us. It's only profitable. So we need to do it. So we welcome y'all for being here and thank you so much. I know God appreciates it.
No better place.
No better place to be. So we're going to attempt to sing number 545 after this song. Maurice, you have the opening prayer. So number 545, This World Is Not My Home. We'll try to sing the first and last verse. Did I run Julie off already?
Yeah,
Okay.
took too long.
Usually they wait till I start talking before they... All right, number 545, This World Is Not My Home. Again, the first and last verse. So let's all try to sing out the best we can. Let us sing. This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Just up in glory land we'll live eternally. The saints on every hand are shouting victory. Their song of sweetest praise drifts back from heaven's shore, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Brother Bruce.
Let us pray. Father God, we thank you for the opportunity to be here, to study your word, to study what Jesus faced and what he faced and how he taught us to face our difficulties today. We thank you for the measure of health that we have, that we can be here. We pray for those who could not be here. We pray for those who, especially those who made the decision not to be here. We thank you for the many small congregations that meet faithful people that want to learn more about you and serve you. Go with us today, help us to pay attention to our lesson, and we ask you to be with those who have been named sick, and we ask you to comfort them. We ask you to help the doctors and nurses to bring good medical attention to their needs. And we pray for this country. We pray for the leaders of this country. We pray that they reflect upon the true meaning of life and liberty, freedom. And we thank you for those who are defending our freedom at this time. And go with us in all that we do. Amen.
All right, if you guys would turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. So we are in the midst of this chapter, and so we Jesus led off the chapter with the parable of the wedding feast. And then last week we looked at questions about paying taxes. So we've seen the Jewish leaders are continually trying to trip Jesus up. So this is a series of questions they're asking him, more like a kind of a grilling session. And they're trying to get him to say something. Like with the taxes, they were hoping he'd say something either that would get him in trouble with the Roman government or would get him in trouble with the Jewish people where they would turn against him. And so we're ready today. We want to see this next question that they're going to ask Jesus with the same goal, trying to trip him up. And what do you think the results will be? Are you guys prophets? What do you think? Will they be successful? Yeah, I predict they're going to fail. Right? So, but they keep trying, at least for a little while. They're just about getting ready to get to the point where they're going to give up, okay? But so far, they keep plugging away, thinking they can get him, but they never can. He always gives the masterful answer. So today we're going to look at, they're going to ask him a question about the resurrection. Okay? And so we are in chapter 22. We are ready to begin in verse 23. And we're going to read through verse 33. So if you'd read along with me. Matthew 22, beginning in verse 23. The same day came to him the Sadducees, which say that there is no resurrection, and asked him, saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. Now there were with us 7 brethren, and the first, when he had married a wife, deceased, and having no issue, left his wife unto his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third unto the 7th. And last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? For they all had her. Jesus answered and said unto them, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. But as touching the resurrection of the dead, have you not read that which was spoken unto you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitude heard this, they were astonished at his doctrine. So once again, he destroys what they're trying to do. So, first of all, we saw that the Pharisees tried to make Jesus look bad, and they strike out. Then we saw they send the Herodians in, and they ask him about the taxes, and they strike out. So next up here, we see the Sadducees. Now it's their turn to come up to bat and see if they can do anything. And as we've noted, they're also going to strike out. They're not going to get anywhere. Now, many of the priests that were in the Jewish leadership, a lot of them were Sadducees, and a lot of them were wealthy. So they had a lot of influence, just generally speaking, among the Jewish people. Okay? Now, the Sadducees, they accepted as absolute authority the scriptures, the books, the 5 books of the Bible that were written by Moses. They accepted that as absolute authority. Okay? Now, these first 5 books, you may or may not have heard these terms, but you're talking about Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books of the Old Testament. In Hebrew, they're known as the Torah. Okay, so sometimes you'll hear somebody will mention, well, you read about this in the Torah. Well, they're talking about those first 5 books. Or sometimes in the Greek, they'll refer to as the Pentateuch. So you might hear somebody say, well, you'll find that in the Pentateuch. So the Torah, the Pentateuch, that's talking about those first 5 books that Moses wrote in the Old Testament that lead off the Bible. So that's what we're talking about. Okay. So the Sadducees, they totally accept what Moses said. Yes, sir.
I gotta be careful in auctions and your classes, not to touch my glasses.
Oh, okay. So you did not have a question. You just.
Yeah, and I'm not buying anything either.
Okay. Well, that's good. I'm not really selling anything.
Yes, you are.
No, this is for free. The gospel is free, so I'm not selling it. I'm giving it to you, right? As God has given it to us. So, anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so talking about the Torah or the Pentateuch. So they accept that what Moses wrote came from God, but they were known. The Sadducees rejected the idea of there being such a thing as a resurrection. They didn't believe in that. They didn't believe in angels or spirits. Okay, so hold your place here. Turn over to the book of Acts, chapter 23. Acts chapter 23. This is where we're told about this. We see it in several places. Acts 23, look at verse 8. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Okay, so that's one of the major differences. People say, what's the difference between a Pharisee and a Sadducee? Well, they're both Jewish leaders, but here you see the key difference. The Pharisees accept, yes, there's a resurrection, yes, there are angels, there are spirits. The Sadducees deny all that. They don't believe in that. Okay, so that's the big difference between the two. So here with Jesus, they're trying to mock the concept of the resurrection. So they don't believe in it anyway. So they're basically kind of presenting this ridiculous scenario, trying to make Jesus look foolish and trying to make the idea of the resurrection look foolish, right? So, well, hey, what about this? What if this happened? How would this work? Okay? And so we see here in verses 24 through 28, when they describe this, so you've got a man, he marries a woman, the man dies, they haven't had any children. And so then the woman marries his brother. They don't have any children. Then she marries the third brother. And all the way she marries all 7 brothers and never has any children for whatever reason. Doesn't have any children. And then finally she dies. Okay, so they asked him, so well, in the resurrection there in verse 28, well, whose wife shall she be? Because she was married to all 7 of them. So whose wife is she going to be in heaven, basically, is what they're asking. And again, they're trying to mock this idea of the resurrection. Okay? Now, what they're referring to here, you go, okay, why would she marry all 7 brothers? Well, they're referring to the Old Testament law. Again, they accepted the 5 books of the Torah or the Pentateuch that Moses had written. So in the book of Deuteronomy, okay, in the book of Deuteronomy, if we were to go, we're not going to go read it, but you can note it. Deuteronomy 25 and verses 5 and 6 is where they're finding this, and it states that if a husband dies childless, then if he's got brothers, his widow should marry his brother so that she can have a child with the brother. That way the family name gets carried on. Okay, and so this is what the Sadducees are referring to. Well, you know, in the law of Moses it says she's got to try her best to carry on the family name, so you've got to marry the brother. If that doesn't work, you've got to marry another brother, and so on. Okay, and so that's where they're getting this from. So then in verses 29 and 30, we see that Jesus, of course, exposes their ignorance. So they are, correctly quoting what Deuteronomy says, but they're showing that they really don't understand anything about what God has set up or the Messiah. So Jesus says, you do err. In other words, you're wrong. You don't really know the Scriptures. You don't understand the power of God. You haven't been listening to anything I've been teaching. Okay? And so he exposes their ignorance, and he's telling them in verse 30 He says, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. Okay? So Jesus is saying that in heaven, what will you not find there? Marriage does not, nobody's going to be married to anybody in heaven. Why not? It's heaven. Is there any need for marriage in heaven? No, we're all equal under God, right? So marriage is an earthly institution. God set it up as a way to be fruitful and multiply, right? That's got to be done within the confines of a scriptural marriage. Marriage is for us not to be alone. Why he created Eve for Adam. It was good for the man not to be alone, right? So that's an earthly thing. Marriage has no purpose or use in eternal heaven. There's no reason to do that. So that's simply a human, earthly thing. And so Jesus said, you don't even understand that heaven is not going to be like earth. Okay, I'm thinking you're not rubbing your head now. So, what is it?
How do you address all the people who feel like they want to see their mate in heaven?
Well, we've talked about before that the Bible seems to indicate, if like when you we looked earlier in Matthew, the transfiguration, right? And so you've got some of the apostles are there, and they see Moses and Elijah with Jesus. How did they know who Moses and Elijah were?
They knew him on earth.
Yeah, but did they ever know him on earth? No, they've been dead a long time, right? And did they have photographs back then or video? Yeah, so do I know what Moses looks like? I don't have a clue, right? Because I never met him. We don't have any photos. We don't have any video of him. So how did the apostles know that was Moses? How did the apostles know that was Elijah? We're going to know each other, right? Okay, and then you think about the rich man and Lazarus, right? So he's in torment, and Lazarus is in comfort in Abraham's bosom. But the rich man he knew who Abraham was. The rich man had never seen Abraham or never met Abraham, but he knew who he was. So we're going to know each other in heaven.
But how do you think about you won't have earthly feelings,
Right. So,
earthly thoughts.
like if you both go to heaven, or Janice and I go to heaven, which is what our goal is, if we go there, I don't pretend to totally understand how it's going to work, because God, all I know is we're going to know each other. So I will know Janice. Will I remember that we were married on earth? I don't know. I will know her as a fellow Christian. You two will know each other as fellow Christians. Will you remember you were husband and wife? Maybe. I don't know. I just know a lot of things of our earthly existence will be wiped away, because God says there's no sorrow, there's no tears. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that we don't remember, because it would make us sad, right? If I knew, well, here was somebody I really cared about, and I'm looking around heaven and he's not here, he must have gone to hell, I'd be really sad about that. So I'm not going to know that. So I don't know that we're going to remember all the earthly things, but I think what it's teaching, we're all going to know each other as fellow saints, and we're going to know who everybody is.
You begin an existence in heaven in your praises.
Yes.
In my mind, you would begin an existence. I can't say the word existence.
Existence, yes.
Begin relationship there.
Right. And so the relationships that we had here will no longer be relevant or important. So I think we'll all know each other, but like I said, will we remember details about our relationship on earth? The Bible doesn't say, so I don't really know. What I do know is Jesus said there's no marriage in heaven, so we won't be considered husband and wife at that point. Right? So he's saying, you guys are making a mistake. You're trying to apply an earthly standard, which God created for here, but it's not true there, because it's just not, there's no reason to be married in heaven. It's not necessary. So he's telling you, you're misinterpreting You're taking an earthly thing and you're trying to apply it to heaven, and that's two different places and two different sets of circumstances. Okay? And so if you really loved God and you really studied His Word, and if you really had been listening to all the things I've been teaching, you boys would know that. But you're making all these mistakes because you're trying to set me up, you're trying to trap me, and that's just simply not going to work. Okay? So what about the angels? Do the angels marry?
No.
Nope. Okay? Here's an interesting question that I don't have the answer to. Don't know, but are there female angels? The Bible never mentions any.
They're on earth.
Yes. Oh boy, he got some brownie points right there. I'm going to use that line when I go home tonight.
I'm sitting with one.
Yes, that's right. In a lot of ways, our wives are angels to us. They really are. But yeah, are there female angels? Is there even such a thing as male and female? I mean, the only angels that are mentioned by name, Gabriel, they're always in the male tent. And when they're visited on earth, they always appear as a man in human form. So is there such a thing as female angels? I would tend to say no, but I can't say that for sure. The Bible never says there's no such thing as female. Maybe there are, and there's never mentioned. But I would tend to think no, because again, there's no marriage in heaven. Why would you need male and female angels? I don't think there's a need for that. So I guess they're all the angels are alike, right? So he's saying you don't have any need for this in heaven. So he's exposing their ignorance on this. And so then we get to the end of this passage. So in verse 31, so you messed this up, but let's go back to the idea of the resurrection. You know, you told that story trying to trap me, but it's not going to be any marriage, but there is going to be a resurrection. You boys don't believe in it, but it is true. Right? So as touching on the resurrection of the dead, it said, have you not read what was spoken by God? So what's he talking about? Read what? Where do we read God? The Bible, the Scriptures, right? He said, you boys claim to be experts on the Torah, the Pentateuch. Have you not read? God mentions the resurrection, but you boys don't believe it. But you claim to be experts on the Bible, but apparently you haven't read it or you didn't pay attention to it. Right? So did you not read that which was spoken unto you by God? Verse 32, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Okay, so Jesus here is quoting Exodus chapter 3 and verse 6. So again, part of the Pentateuch or the Torah. So if you guys believe in that, you guys claim to be experts in it, don't you remember reading this in Exodus 3 and verse 6? Where God, when he says, I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he doesn't say past tense, I was the God of Abraham. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what does that tell us about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Okay, so let's look at it this way. So like, Leon, I know you were married before. Your husband passed away. What was his name? Freddie, yeah. Would you say today, I am the wife of Freddie, or I was the wife of Freddie? Was, because he's passed away. You are the wife of Maurice. You were the wife of Freddie. But God doesn't say, well, I was the God of Abraham because Abraham's passed away. He's still using present tense. I am the God of Abraham. So what does that tell us about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Come on, guys. We can do it. What does it tell us about them? Remember, we're talking about the resurrection. Are they told what? They're still living. Well, now wait a minute, Bobby. Now we know these guys are dead.
But they've been resurrected.
But how are they still alive? Do they have a spirit? Is that still alive? Still is. Right? We have an eternal soul. Right? So Abraham's physical body's been dead for a long time, but what about his spirit? Still there. Right? Still alive. And we're all going to be resurrected, right? So that's what Jesus is saying. God, notice he says, God is not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living. So Jesus is saying it right there. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are all still alive. And again, from the earthly standpoint, we'd be going, wait a minute, that doesn't, they're dead. Yeah, their physical body, the shell they were in, that's dead. But Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, at this point in the first century, they were still alive. What about today? They're still alive. What about 10 million years from now?
Yes.
They'll still be, right? And you and me will be too. We're going to be in one place or the other, hopefully the good place. We're going to be alive somewhere. Okay? And so Jesus is saying you are wrong when you say there's no resurrection, because absolutely there is, because everybody has an eternal spirit. And that will live on forever. The physical body will die, but the spirit will never die. Okay? So that's what he's telling them. They're physically dead, but the spirit lives on. Okay? So he's confirming here Jesus is the existence of an eternal soul that we all have. So we have seen so far the Pharisees, they came and they tried to trip up Jesus and they struck out. Then the Herodians came and they tried to trip up Jesus and they struck out. Then the Sadducees came and they tried to trip up Jesus and they struck out. Who's next? Step right on up, boys. Step right on up. Who's next to try to do this, right? So, here we go. We're going to have another question. Okay, this time the Pharisees, well, let's take another shot. Okay, we didn't do so good the last time, but let's take another shot. So the Pharisees now, they're going to ask Jesus about what is the greatest commandment. And these are verses that we've read quite a bit lately in some of the sermons that we've talked about. So they're going to ask him about this. So we're going to read verses 34 through 40. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him and saying, Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Okay? And so we talked about this recently when we were talking about Amy Grant. This is what she quotes. Well, just love God, love each other. Therefore, we have to accept everything. Right? So if I have a lesbian niece, well, I just have to praise her and accept. We can't condemn anybody for anything. That's how she interprets this. That's not what Jesus is saying at all. That, well, as long as you do it in love, it's fine. It's not what he's saying. Okay? So, but the Pharisees are going to take this shot here because the Jews, they constantly argued over what was the greatest commandment. What's the most important commandment? Out of all these commandments we have, they were arguing about that all the time. Okay? And so they would debate, was it, well, maybe it's circumcision. Maybe that's the greatest commandment. Or maybe it's animal sacrifice. And others, no. I think it's tithing. It's how much we give. And so they would argue about all these things. And so they're going, well, let's just ask Jesus. He claims to be the Messiah. Let's just ask him. And again, they're hoping he'll say something wrong. They're hoping he'll say something that will anger somebody. Now, the Roman government's not going to care so much about this, but they're hoping he'll anger some of the Jews based on what he says. Again, they think they've got him trapped because whatever he says, since they all argue about it, well, if he picks this one, then the people that think it's this one, they're going to be upset and so forth. So they think they've got him backed into a corner. But we've seen that before. And how'd that work out? Yeah, they really didn't have him, he winds up backing them into a corner. So it's going to be the same thing here. This is not going to be a problem for Jesus. Now, the Jewish leadership had calculated at that time there were 284 positive laws of Moses. 284. They also calculated that there were 365 negative laws of Moses. And so that's, if my math is right, that's a total of 613 commandments that Moses had given out, of course, coming from God, right? And Moses had laid these things out. 613. And so they would argue over which was more important than the others. Okay? So, notice here in verses 35 and 36. Go back on the wrong page here. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him. What's the great commandment of the law? So, tempting him. So Matthew uses that word tempting. So the question probably began that way. That again, he's trying to trip him up. But there's also some indication that maybe it does, for the lawyer who asked it, maybe it doesn't end up that way. So he kind of starts out trying to trip him up. But we notice, if you'll be turning, hold your place here, turn over to Mark. We want to see, we get a little more detail in this. The man must have had some sincerity, or maybe he was convinced by Jesus' answer, because Mark, notice what Mark tells us in Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. And let's begin reading in verse 32. And the scribe, talking about the lawyer, had asked him the question, and the scribe said unto him, Well, master, thou hast said the truth. So we get his response to what Jesus said here, which Matthew doesn't record. Well, master, thou hast said the truth, for there is one God, and there is none other but he. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love his neighbor as himself, is more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. So remember, let's stop right there. So remember, Jesus was always critical of the Pharisees because they put emphasis on what? Yeah, just the ceremony, right? Being a stickler for the rules. And Jesus said, you're missing the bigger picture about love and charity and mercy and compassion. And he said that, the love of everything is more important than the animal sacrifice. So this guy, apparently, he's getting it, right? He said that loving God and loving each other, that's more important than the burnt offerings and sacrifices. And we're going to, well, wait a minute, but didn't Moses say you had to do those things? Yeah, and where'd Moses get that? Did Moses make that up? We got to make sacrifices to God. Where'd he get that from? From God, right? God told him to do it, right? So, does this mean here that we could, if we were Jews under the old law, could we ignore that? Oh, I don't have to sacrifice a lamb anymore? Is that what he's saying? No. No. What he's saying is, like the Pharisees, they were guilty of that's all they were going through the motions. You said to sacrifice an animal, so I'm going to sacrifice an animal. But is your heart really in it? Are you doing it really to please God? Or are you trying to look self-righteous to everybody else? And that's what they were doing, right? So he's not saying burnt offerings are not important. Yes, they were under the old law. But if that's all you're doing, you're missing the big picture. Okay? So let's apply this to us today. We don't sacrifice animals anymore. We don't live under the old law anymore. But for us, here's the parallel. Here's the application. If somebody comes to church and let's say they're faithful in their attendance. They're here every Sunday and they're here every Wednesday night. They're always at worship service. But that's all they do. Okay, well, God said to go to church, so I'm going to go to church. Well, he did say that, and we have to be here. Okay? But if I'm only here because I have to be, not because I want to be, Is that pleasing to God?
No.
Not, absolutely not. It is totally unacceptable. I'm wasting my time. I might as well be out on the golf course. Okay? God wants me to want to be here. Not just because I'm obeying a commandment. And, again, if that's all I do, so the rest of the week, I live a very sinful life and I act like everybody else, but oh, I'm holier than thou on Sunday, right? I don't do anything else for the Lord. I don't love my fellow man. I don't help people. I don't do anything. I just come to church. And when I'm at church, you know, let's sing this song, and maybe either I don't sing, or if I do sing, my heart's not in it. I'm just, well, you know, God told me to say, okay, I'll sing the song, but I don't really lie. I don't want to sing it, and I don't care about it. Well, God, you know, may fool the rest of y'all if I'm doing that, but God knows my heart's not in it. So are any of those things pleasing to Him? No. You know, I'm wasting my time. Right? So I've got to, you know, John 4:24, God is a spirit. They that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. The right spirit. God, I love you. That's why I'm here. I'm not here just because you commanded me to be here. I'm here because I want to be here. I want to please you, Lord. I know this makes you happy. You want me to sing even though my voice is terrible? You know what? I'm going to sing. And I know that you want me to want to do this for you. I'm not doing it to please everybody else or please myself. I'm doing it for you. That's the equivalent of what the Pharisees did. So they were going through the motions of the ceremonies, but they weren't really obeying God in spirit. It would be like you and me, yeah, I'm going to come to church, but I'm not really going to do anything else for God. Well, we'd be guilty of the same things that the Pharisees were doing. So he doesn't mean that he's not telling them you don't have to animal sacrifice anymore, but he's trying to tell them, hey, you need to get the big picture here. Why are you doing the animal sacrifice? It's not to look righteous for other people. It's to please God because you want to please God. Hey, God told me to do this. I'm excited about it. I'm going to do it. And that's not what the Pharisees were doing. Okay? So apparently in Mark here we see this guy, even though he's a lawyer for the Jewish leadership, he's starting maybe to understand it. Okay? And some people, well, how do we know is he mocking Jesus here? Maybe he's not really sincere. Well, look at the next verse, verse 34. They're still in Mark 12, verse 34. And when Jesus saw that he answered discreetly, he said unto him, Thou art not far from the kingdom of God. And no man after that durst ask him any question. Okay, so notice he answered discreetly, so honestly, and Jesus said, You're not far from the kingdom of God. So tell me, if he were mocking Jesus, if he were not sincere, would Jesus have known that? Yeah. So this tells me, again, maybe the guy started out to tempt Jesus, but somewhere in Jesus' answer, his heart was convicted because Jesus himself said, you know what? You're on the right track, young man. You're starting to go in the right direction. See, because you can't fool Jesus, right? So we've seen the Pharisee, oh, Master, everything you said is true. Well, they're mocking him there, or they're trying to flatter him. That's not the case here, because Jesus accepts what he says yeah, that's a good answer. You're starting to understand what's important. Okay, so let's go back then to Matthew 22. And so Jesus gives the answer there, as we've seen in verses 37 through 40. Love God. How are we to love God?
With all your heart, mind.
All thy heart, all thy soul, all thy mind. Other places the Bible says all your might, all your strength. Okay? It's got to be a genuine, deep, pure love for God. Because what kind of love does he have for us? Yeah. Right? God loves us greater than we can possibly comprehend, right? So as much as we can in our human form, we are to love him with that passion. Right? Not, oh, well, yeah, I love Jesus. You know. No, we need to mean it with every fiber of our being. Right? And so that's what Jesus is telling us. Now, Jesus is quoting from Deuteronomy 6 and verse 5. He's also quoting from Leviticus 19 and verse 18. So again, quoting from the Torah, the Pentateuch. Okay? And so what Jesus is saying, again, some people like Amy Grant have misinterpreted. Well, that's all there is to it. No, what Jesus is saying is that these two commandments summarize the entire law of God. Okay? So he's saying that if we have a fundamental obligation to love God and to serve Him, we have an obligation to love our fellow man and to service them, love and obey God, and serve the needs of our fellow man. So what Jesus is saying here is like, if we truly do that, if we really love God with all our mind, all our heart, all our soul, if we really are doing that, and if we love our fellow man like God commands us to, if we're genuinely doing that, then will we obey all the other commands of God? Yes, we will. That's what Jesus says. He's not saying, because what some people are interpreting is that everything else in the Bible doesn't matter. It's just that's what she said, right? It really, it's that simple. It's just those two. No. As I said then, I said, why did God write all the rest of this? Why does God tell me all these other things if all I got to do is love, love, love? What he's saying is, if you really love me and if you really love your fellow man, you will obey the whole Bible. You'll do your very best to obey everything that God's told you to do.
The rest of it is how to.
Right, right. And so that's why Jesus in verse 40, on these two commandments hang all the law. Everything comes down to love. If you love God, if you love your fellow man, you will do what the Bible said to do. Okay, so some people are saying, well, hey, if you love God, you love your fellow man, you can ignore everything else. No. If you love God and love your fellow man, you won't ignore everything else. You will try to obey everything else. Because if you decide, I'm going to ignore everything else, what does that mean? I'm going to ignore the rest of the Bible. What does that mean about these two commandments?
You don't love me.
Yeah, I don't love God and I don't love my fellow man. If I'm going to ignore everything God told me to do, how can I possibly claim I love Him? And if I know it says I'm supposed to help other people, but I'm not really going to help other people. Oh, but I still love them. No, I don't. If I did, I'd try to help them. There's some people that you can't help, but we're talking about if you have an opportunity to help somebody, then try to help somebody, right? If you really love them, that's what you'll do. So Jesus is not saying, yeah, you can ignore everything else. He's saying in verse 40 that the whole law hangs on this. You love God, love your fellow man, you will obey everything God's told you to do, and then you'll be in good shape. That's what he's telling us here. All right? Yes.
If you become a citizen of the United States, you do the minimum to become that.
Mm-hmm.
But once you become a citizen, you learn that the laws. So when you become a citizen or a child of God, it's the same.
Right. As a child of God, there are laws that God has laid down for me that He expects me to follow. And I did a sermon about that a few weeks ago, right? About when we were talking about the characteristics of Christ, and we got to Christ as King. Right? So every kingdom has a territory, it has laws, and so we are to obey the laws of the King. Just like, I have to obey the laws of the United States, otherwise I can be arrested, I can be fined, I can be in prison. There are negative consequences if I don't obey those laws. Well, God has said there are negative consequences for us if we don't obey His laws. So there's nowhere in, we can't interpret these verses right here as saying we can ignore everything else. No, God wrote this whole book for a reason, and all the things that are in it, He wants us to follow. Jesus is saying if you really love God and you really love your fellow man, you'll follow everything God's told you to do. Okay? All right, any questions or comments? Thought we might get through the chapter today, but we're almost done. So Lord willing, next week we'll look at the last few verses of this chapter, and we're going to see where Jesus is going to turn the tables, and he's basically going to say, okay, boys, y'all had your turn. You've asked me a whole bunch of questions. Let me ask you some questions, okay? And that's what we're going to see in those last few verses, Lord willing. All right, so we'll take a break and then we'll have our worship service.